All right, so we will get started. Looks like all of our amazing panelists are here. So as I said a little bit earlier, my name is Rachel Thomas. My pronouns are she, her. Thank you so much for everyone for joining this panel discussion, for WCAPS for hosting, and our continued partnership with Out National Security. To give some background on myself, I am the Senior Military Advisor at the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues within the United States State Department. Within WCAPS, I co-chair the sub-working group Cultivating Common Convergence under the Redefining National Security Working Group. So I wanted to open with a little bit of a scene setter. As we go through this panel discussion, I wanted to remind everyone that this is a safe space for respectful questions coming from a place of learning and a place of discussion. We sent out a glossary of commonly used terminology to all of those who registered for the webinar. If there's anything that is discussed or any acronyms that are used that you may be unfamiliar with, please feel free to post them into the chat and we will address them as necessary, because we do realize that everyone's coming from a little bit of different backlines, different foundations and baselines. So we want to make sure that everyone is able to be on the same page and to enjoy the discussion. And then I just wanted to also say, as we do this discussion, having a little bit of a content advisory. So some of the things that we talk about may be sensitive, they may not, but I just wanted to have everyone be aware of that in terms of discrimination, homophobia, racism, sexism, and the things that we experience in our everyday lives. For the Q&A session, and I will go over this again when we get to it, please use the Q&A chat function rather than the chat box so that we can keep track of all of the questions that come through from the audience. So in the first 100 days policy recommendation for the Biden administration that WCAPS released last December, we realized the necessity to include voices of the LGBTQ persons, especially women of color and non-binary persons. And we highlighted that throughout the document. These recommendations are only the beginning of the steps that we have to take to ensure that we keep these perspectives elevated and acknowledged. So events like this also provide the opportunity to share our lived experiences, accomplishments, and perspectives on the intersectionality of living life as a queer woman, a queer person of color. The discussion today will be the first of many open and honest discussions within WCAPS, and I'm so happy to have the opportunity to participate in this panel. During this event, we will start with a moderated discussion, followed by a question and answer session. We will leave the chat open, like I mentioned earlier. So if there are resources attendees may like to share or points that the panelists make that you'd like to comment on, you can please put that in the chat. If there are questions, put that in the Q&A part. That way, as we work through event follow-ups, we'll have your comments and suggestions as part of the record for today. And then we will also put in some social media links. And I believe Nida has already put in some, so to help follow us on social media. Before I welcome our panelists, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, the founder of WCAPS and the driver behind a myriad of amazing initiatives, events, and opportunities that she provides to young, career, mid-career, and senior level professionals in the network. Ambassador Jenkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome, everyone. Welcome our amazing panelists. I am so looking forward to today. One of the things that I love so much about WCAPS and about our members is our willingness to speak our truths, our willingness to create a safe space and to maintain a safe space. And that's what we're doing today. I'm so glad that we're doing this. And as Rachel said, you know, there are things that we put into our publication, and you can find that on the website for the first 100 days. And we talked a lot about these kind of issues. So I very much look forward to the discussion. I look forward to audience participation. I look forward to continuing our safe space discussions. I look forward to the future discussions. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel for what's going to be an exciting event. So thank you again for all the panelists for being here, and for all of the audience members for listening in and hopefully participating. Thanks.
Thank you so, so much, Ambassador Jenkins. So now getting to the reason that everyone is actually here, and I will introduce the panelists. So the first is Pam Campos Palma. Pam is a distinguished political strategist and senior advisor to policymakers, campaigns, and movement leaders in the United States and internationally on matters of defense, security, and civilian military affairs. She served as an Air Force intelligence office and counterterrorism analyst from 2006 to 2017 on active duty and reserves with time in Germany, Iraq, Kyrgyzstan, and Afghanistan. She has been recognized widely as a national leader, helping shape the future of foreign policy and the military veteran space for justice and change. Is currently the director of peace and security for the Working Families Party, a WCAPS advisory board member, and a Defense Council member of the Truman National Security Project. Thank you so much, Pam, for being here. Next, we have Amber Mcintyre. Amber Mcintyre is a queer Black woman, she, her pronouns, from St. Petersburg, Florida. She attended Florida State and has an MPA from American University. She spent about 9 years at the Department of State as a civil servant, including as a foreign affairs officer, focusing on international religious freedom in sub-Saharan Africa. Since 2017, Amber served as a management consultant focusing on emergency management and resilience programs. And now she's back at State as a political appointee with the Biden-Harris administration, serving as the Deputy Chief of Staff of Operations for U.S. Mission to the United Nations, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield at the U.S. Mission to the UN in New York. Thank you so much, Amber, for taking time out of your supremely busy schedule to be on this panel. And then I would like to introduce Nadia and Alia from the Queer Arabs podcast. The Queer Arabs podcast is a growing collection of dialogues surrounding the intersection of Southwest Asian and North African, also known as SWANA, and LGBTQ identities. Recording in English and Arabic, with hosts based in the US and guests based all over, the podcast highlights queer artists, activists, and organizers from SWANA and its diasporas, as well as anyone whose work shares goals of racial justice, gender liberation, and sex positivity. Thank you so, so much for being here. So I wanted to just get started with a question for Nadia, Alia, and Amber. In the discussions prior to this call and in the pre-panel call that we had, we discussed the importance of elevating the narratives and the stories of LGBTQ community in various cultures globally, especially within the SWANA regions and the Middle East and North Africa regions. A lot of the work that the podcast has done, and Amber, that you've done, falls at the intersection of culture, gender identity, and religion in these regions and in other parts of Africa. In your opinion, why is it important to make sure that these recommendations or these experiences are highlighted? And we'll have Amber go first.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks to my hero, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, and I also see Ambassador Gina Abercrombie with Stanley on the line. You guys have been such inspirations to people like me, and just thank you for pulling this group together. You know, Rachel, when we talked about this earlier this week, a part of the one thing that keeps coming back to me is just the power of self-determination. And when we put ourselves in these highly visible positions, or we get the opportunity to sort of elevate our stories and to share our experiences, we essentially take our self-determination into our own hands. And that's so powerful because a lot of work that we do, especially in foreign policy and national security, you know, it can kind of seem out of touch for folks, especially like the grassroots work that the Queer podcast tries to elevate with people on the ground. They don't often feel like they are a part of foreign policy or they are a part of national security because they don't necessarily behave a certain way or have a certain background or foundation, right? I mean, if you come into the State Department and you know people in the Foreign Service, a lot of these folks are generationally engaged in foreign policy because their parents taught them and their parents parents took them overseas and they just have a certain connection to the world and global affairs, and in a way that folks like me grew up in small town St. Pete had to go out and seek. And so I think visibility is important because it reminds us that we all have the power of self-determination, and to be able to help solve big problems, even though we're all just, one person. In work like international religious freedom and like religious minorities in places where they're persecuted or where they're targeted, there's a level of powerlessness that I think I can relate to, having had an experience like mine in America. And so the visibility is really important because it's a reminder of that.
Before we get started, I just want to say I'm Nadia, she's Alia. You can't tell that because we're in the same box. Amber, I think what you said about self-determination is also where we're really coming from. Just basically, essentially, we want people to define their own narratives. Something that comes up often when we're presenting what we do on the podcast to spaces or people outside of our main audience is this savior narrative, which I think predates anything we've done, is just something that is part of colonial history, whether it's about the rights of queer people, rights of women, rights of religious minorities, kind of being made as a prop for colonialism. This idea that those people over there need some more like civilized force to quote unquote save them. And that assumes that people don't have their own organizing work that's already going on, that they don't have their own leaders, that they don't have their own agency. And it's just not the case. We've had amazing opportunities to talk to people who are creating like queer and feminist focused NGOs in a variety of places: Lebanon, Tunisia, the UAE, Palestine, and as well as independent like artists and activists wherever. And obviously not everybody wants the level of visibility of being on a podcast, but that's something we really prioritize, letting people have agency over how much visibility they have, right? And I guess to answer your question about why it's important, how we are highlighting people, and I think is a bit different than most other media platforms that people might have engaged with, is that I think people don't necessarily have positive experiences either with like regional media or with Western media, whether it's straight up, queerphobia and reporting on what organizers are doing, or if it's like a lot of sensationalism, Orientalism coming from Western media. And I think it's not that we approach that by doing a particular counter narrative, but that we just don't approach it with a particular narrative. We really give people agency to determine like how exactly do you want to be presented. With a long form podcast, there's not a lot of clipping people down to like this like sexy little soundbite that says exactly what you are, right? A lot of agency over editing, and essentially people are out there, they're doing the work. We connect, and not just in the region, in the diaspora, everywhere. We just want to connect to people doing positive work and let them represent themselves.
We think of this podcast as being by us and for us, but also being a tool and an accessible tool to audiences like outside the queer Swana community. So that's been nice. And also just like it celebrates like the complexity of the community, rather than, like Nadia said, just kind of like editing things down to this like neat little catchphrase that might be used in a lot of like what's shown, for example, in Western media about the Swana region.
Totally. I think we're just a lot messier than what you might see in, I think, most Western reporting about queer people and queer issues in Swana. And I think that's good because humans are inherently messy.
Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's extremely important to realize and to understand, is that a lot of times people tend to view certain racial minorities or queer or gender as a monolith, and just sort of use that as, oh, well, women this, or the LGBTQ community this, or like, however you want to put it. And so it's very blocky. And so I love the work that you all are doing to bring out those individuals and say, like, here's someone doing art in Lebanon, and here's someone taking photos, and hear their stories and their lived experiences. And Amber, your point on the grassroots, making sure that we're connecting our foreign policy and our policy just domestically as well to what the grassroots organizations are saying, and to understand that until we fix our internal house, it's hard for us to sort of put that externally. And so I actually want to turn to Pam for this next question, because when we talk about the intersectionality of race, sex, gender identity, and sort of the American way of thinking about it, the Western way versus how we sort of transport that to the countries that we're deployed in, the countries that we're helping, it's never really been clear than looking back at even our really recent history of the US Armed Forces, right? The 10-year anniversary of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, DADT, is only this September. So it's still very, very recent. And the ban on transgender service members was just lifted in January. And that's been something that's been debated over and over again. Our colleagues and our fellow members in arms, just their existence and their identities are being debated in courts and on news articles. So there's a normalization of harmful viewpoints and bias that's baked into the current military structure. And I should probably also preface, I am an active duty officer as well. So I probably should have mentioned that. So I come from the DoD side also. But this really does beg the question, how can we approach problem sets in other countries with proposed solutions when we're still struggling with it here in the United States? And as a veteran and grassroots organizer, and who started organizing really in the military, in your experience, what can we do to reconcile these differences?
Yeah, likewise, just really honored to be here. Accountability starts with self. Accountability starts with self. And I mean, the reality is that we are in a rupture moment in this country where we have a choice. We must choose who we want to be moving forward. This is a historic moment for many of us to choose a better world of inclusion. And it is disingenuous, in my view, to parade across the world that we are the country of human rights and inclusion and pluralism, when even in our own institutions that are crafting policy on security, safety, and stability, the national security and foreign policy sector, where we don't have a praxis and an investment, right? A tangible investment. And so while, yes, we have made gains when it comes to equity and inclusion in the sector, I still think that we're on our sea legs, right? And praxis means a lot. And there are more breakthroughs to be had, and there's repair to be done, right? So fundamentally, the question I pose to everyone is, do we meaningfully understand and practice intersectionality in its truest form, in the way that, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw intended it to be, right? When she coined the term, not just, boxes that we got to check because we got our shiny unicorn to parade around because we're diverse and we're good, but a real cultural competency and praxis that understands that people are layered, people are multidimensional, and because our society was shaped through the power of cis, straight, white men who owned land and were wealthy, these interlocking identities impact the way we experience injustice, freedom, oppression, and justice, right? And so I think it's on all of us to really create that repair. And I think that the real stakes, especially right now, as we're figuring out, who we want to be, and I think many of us do share that alignment, is, and I say this with love, our sector, the peace and security sector, is struggling with hegemony, right? senior leadership roles predominantly do not reflect us and our experiences. And I do believe that a lived experience is one of the most important things when we're talking about the safety and security of people. And too often, policies and white papers that are well-intended, right, can be exclusionary in a way that actually endangers the most marginalized. And so a good example of this that I think about a lot, my mother is an immigrant from Honduras. And when I think about, folks that talk about migration and we want to, just blanket migration, but don't actually talk about the threats to transgender asylum seekers from Central America who face a different level of threats, then we're not holistically doing our job. And we should be a country that leaves no one behind. And I think, I'll say, I realized I wasn't straight in high school, but it wasn't until I joined the military where I saw a significant number of people getting kicked out and smeared that the realization of me being out to myself came from fear of being targeted. And my journey as, a cis queer Latina is one where this world isn't ready for me. I've just become very clear that I've been told a lot of lies to push me and many of us into a box that we're never going to fit into, and that we shouldn't, because the world is evolving. And so, lies that I was told in the military were, you're going to be one of the boys or you're going to sleep with everyone. I said, why do I have to make that binary choice? When I went to LGBTQ places, told that, I predominantly by white gay men, bisexuality doesn't exist, so you should leave, and being told to leave. Homophobic messages that really made me struggle as a disabled veteran with my own internalized ableism. And so, my message is that it is a disservice to all of us to live with these traditional lies. And Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the trans ban have done irreparable damage, not just of people getting kicked out by, again, the DoD is our largest our largest government agency. And it was policy, and that filters into culture. And the last thing I'll say is that we can no longer depreciate and devalue the power of grassroots organizing. For too long, we have just kind of hoped that our white papers, like brilliant people put so much energy into these white papers, and grassroots power and energy and people power is what actually makes them come to life and impact real people in real places. And so we have to bridge the two. I've been very passionate about saying we can no longer have a chasm between grass tops policymaking and grassroots lived experience and power, because it is the people. Change comes from the roots. Change comes from below. And some of the most powerful people in change across the world are queer, marginalized people of color, trans people. And so we can no longer, I say this as a national security military intelligence analyst, it is imperative. It is a security imperative that we invest in civil society and grassroots organizing.
Pam, you said something that struck me, and you said, the agency, the institution, or America even wasn't ready for you and your identity and how you show up in the world. And I think that is the realest statement, right? The national security apparatus that exists in this country is not ready for queer leadership of color. It's getting there, but it's not there. And one of the things that I thought about in the early days of having been on the presidential transition team and seeing how much energy was getting put into sort of D&I thinking and strategizing and figuring out how do we, especially at the State Department, diversify at all levels of the State Department, including in the highest ranks of the Foreign Service. And I thought, okay, people are going to do a whole lot of recruiting and talking about getting people in the building. But I worried about the people that get in the building, because you really become a pioneer in a way that is truly self-sacrificing when we're still having the first gay this, the first Black this, the first Latina this. These people are going into a building that's not ready for them. So while on one hand, someone is really excited that they're checking the box and that when they put race next to a list of names, that it's 30% Black and 30% white and 30% other, and they feel good about that. But what I don't feel good about is knowing that these people are coming to a culture where they're going to have to work harder than everybody else, take more, you know, shit than everybody else, have to deal with things that their counterparts will never have to struggle with. So I thought, you know, we're coming in the building and there's a ton of us in the administration, but when the rubber hits the road, the culture is still not where it needs to be for us to be able to show up as our authentic selves, as, you know, our high performing selves who can be value added to policy discussions, to bring great ideas to government solutions on these really, really big problems, right? Because we're all on this call because we want to solve big problems. And you can't solve the big problem without getting to the personal problem. And so I often think about how we ensure that we aren't martyring ourselves, that we're protecting our peace, that we're protecting the peace of other Black leaders and leaders of color coming into national security who will be expected to outperform, but will be perceived as however they'll be perceived because the culture just hasn't caught up with the reality that there are brilliant change makers, global change makers who are not white men, who are going to be the difference between us moving into a future and us living in the past. And so even coming in and like, you know, I'm so lucky because I get to work with Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, who has made diversity a passion project for her entire life. She had no choice, right? You're a Black woman from Louisiana and you've experienced all these things, but she never closes a door. She never creates a distance between young leaders, leaders of color, queer leaders, and how they want to contribute, right? And that's because we all understand that the future relies on people being able to, again, self-determine, but to pursue the things that they love in a way that they don't have to make personal sacrifices to make change. And, you know, in national security, we lose a lot of good talent to private sector, to other areas where people can more so be themselves. And it's a sad thing because the government, the American government, the US government is the shining example around the world for diversity. And yet, you know, I did some PD work in Gambia one time, and I was just talking about how great America was. And there was a young Muslim girl, she probably was 14 or 13, and she's like, how did you get this job? Because I know in America, they don't let Black people do really great jobs. They don't let you guys do cool foreign policy jobs because you're Black. And I was like, whew, yes. And also, things change and things happen. And I was able to break through the system, and I was willing to make some sacrifices, and I was willing to know that my experience might not be 100% fair all the time, but it was something that I chose to do and that I was willing to do. But it was a really good question because, again, our own credibility and our ability to be an authentic country where we say and do, we mean and say what we do, right? Because the laws are there, the words on paper, melting pot, land of the home, free, brave, all of those things, they're on paper and we want to believe those things. But if you don't let the individuals who make up the institutions operate in authenticity, the institution itself is going to be fake and a farce. And I think in the State Department, you have a lot of people who have literally dedicated their careers to seeing change, to making sure we get Black ambassadors, to make sure we get the highest ranking roles considered among queer leaders or among leaders of color. And it's happening, and we have Black ambassadors on the call today, but you know, if you walk into the State Department pre-COVID and you look at the brown faces and the Black faces in the department, you're going to see that a lot of them are in management roles, support roles. They're not making decisions. They're not the ones carrying the message. They're not the ones getting the credit for the work. So we do have such a long way to go. And I'm just personally tired of the people of color having to do all the labor to get us there. Now, we're going to do the labor because that's who he is, and we know that's who we are, and we know the importance of this work. But I'm so excited to see more white people and white men really say, I'm going to do the labor to own racism and
Right.
to figure out how we can counter these biases that hurt people, right? Like they hurt people, they hurt people's families, and they prevent us from getting to the future where we say we want to be. And so a part of all of this, and we will probably talk about tokenizing, but I'm willing to tokenize myself if it means that it's helping the greater cause. But I'm not willing to tokenize myself if I'm just checking a box for someone who doesn't really have any interest in seeing diversity executed in a meaningful way, like at a bone and nerves and bloodstream way, because everything up until this point, and I do feel that there has been a real shift, but so by and large, everything up until this point has felt very cosmetic and very surface.
Yeah, I think those are extremely, I mean, I just want to give you all the snaps, like both Pam and Amber, for that, because it's a lot of what I've felt too about in the State Department and just writ large within the military, within the US government, that sort of burden of always having to work 20 to 30% harder just to prove yourself, as a woman in the military, as a queer person, as a person of color. And it's tiring, it's exhausting. All of this is 100% exhausting. And what's interesting too is what you're talking about with the mid-level and the management. So right now, a recent poll conducted by Gallup highlighted that 1 out of 6 Gen Zers, so Gen Z is 18 through 25, if I remember correctly, identify as LGBTQ in 2020. However, like, this is greatly encouraging because more people are feeling that they're able to come out and able to identify without fear of reprisal. And so this might be more into the United States, because around the world, there's still very, very much a danger to coming out or to even having the thought of you being different. But within the United States, we still don't see a lot of people of color and queer people within senior leadership positions. And so what I'm going to, like, since this conversation is meant to be honest and open and direct, I pulled a couple of numbers. It was a little bit hard to find some of these numbers because a lot of people don't necessarily report on their queerness because of fear of retaliation or fear of being othered or singled out. So according to a 2018 GAO study of the Senior Executive Service, better known as the SES, 81% are white, 10% Black, 4% Hispanic, 3% Asian, and around 2% Indigenous. And an additional data point that I wanted to sort of point out is of the elected officials within the United States, which are, there are 843 of them are LGBTQ identifying. That is 0.17% of all of the elected officials within the United States. 0.17%. And within the 843, 77% of them are white, followed by 20% Hispanic, 6% Black, and 2% Asian or Pacific Islander, and less than 1% each for Indigenous and Middle Eastern. So with all of these, like, we talk about diversity and inclusion, we talk about inclusivity and everything, and you get to this point where you're sort of a check in the box. You're like, oh, you are a Black queer woman, you're going to be perfect for this. And so they put you in here, but then the minute you try and speak up about things, you've gone a little too far. Like, no, we wanted to have you here as our shining beacon, our shining example of what we're doing in diversity. And so the points that you talked about are really interesting in terms of why we don't see people at the senior leadership positions. And a lot of times I think it's burnt out and we're exhausted in trying to do this. And so you basically, I was going to ask the question of what can we do, but you basically have answered it with actually doing meaningful things, funding, resources. What are we doing to make sure it's inclusive? And I see that Nadia and Alia have their hand up, so I will let them go speak.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of continue on this really important conversation about tokenism. I've been thinking throughout this conversation about both the importance of representation, but also about the limits of like a representation only politics. And I think, as Amber kind of alluded to, like, we don't necessarily see ourselves as directly involved in this field. And I think that's a bit different. In fact, I think a lot of people we consider our community don't have a great relationship to just the words national security, and for very real reasons. You know, I think I think there's definitely a gap in this conversation, but I do want to go there because I don't think the white supremacy in our military system as experienced by the people inside of it, and the white supremacy of our military system as experienced by people in countries our military is in, I don't think those are unrelated experiences. I don't think they should be pitted against each other, but rather talked about as like different sides of the same coin. So I think there's always a concern about with just representation and just a very historically problematic system, like whether it's causing a pink washing or POC washing of what the system is doing. And I think I don't think it's unrelated to, Amber, what you were saying about like kind of cosmetic diversity, or the idea that there's perhaps different types of people let in the door, but on too many restrictions, too much professional pressure to perhaps do things where they might make more of a difference. And again, I don't entirely know the answers or entirely know where I'm going with this, but I just think that's a link that needs to be made instead of seeing those as completely unrelated issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one too. I mean, +1, 1,000,000%. I mean, the real question for me is, are we going to share power? Are we going to share power in a real way? And I think one of the big dichotomies that I see is that whatever way, you know, that we want to encapsulate it, but the way that we are talking about safety and security generally, particularly for younger generations. I mean, most of my life, I have only really known crisis, right? I mean, I grew up working class, and I do want to foot stomp. Class is also a really big part of this conversation, right? I've had some jarring experiences where folks who identify as LGBTQ, IA, or queer, you know, will try to relate to me, but there's a significant class differential where their advancement, whether that's through traditional bureaucracy of the State Department, you know, is not the same. It's just not the same, right? Even when I served in the military, I wanted to become a diplomat, and I couldn't. I had to create my professional path completely different because I did not have the same level of access. And so, you know, class is definitely something that I think we should foot stomp. And it is actually regressive to put people in senior, and I've experienced this, to put people in senior leadership roles where they are then expected to shrink and compromise, right? Because it creates a distorted understanding of what their authority and power actually is. And the bottom line, what I was getting to say is that the way that we are dealing with militarism, you know, security, safety, international affairs is changing, right? And there's a little part of me that is like, you might not want it to change, but it's changing. And the younger generation is going to make it change, and new coalitions, interfaith, you know, feminist, gender expansive coalitions cannot, literally our survival requires for this whole thing to change, right? And that's the real tension, is that it is not in the benefit of the people in power to change it, right? And so what I most want people to understand is that we need to move forward together. And that while change is really scary for a lot of folks, resistance to change across every point in history, particularly in this land, has gotten people killed, lynched, and has created more crises, right? In the middle of a pandemic, economic chaos, and endless wars, there is actually a moral and strategic mandate to change the infrastructure of these institutions. And so, you know, the foot stomp is change requires resourcing, it requires power sharing, it requires investment, because otherwise the thing that I'm most allergic to is, we appreciate you because you're different, you're queer, you're brown, and now we want you to do this unpaid labor on this diversity committee. Thank you so much, right? Like, I mean, after 2020, I made a commitment to myself that I'm not going to do, that kind of education for free anymore. Our ancestors have paid way too many costs to do that. And that to me is important if we're going to talk about the question of power and authority sharing in a meaningful way that creates structural change, that is not just based, as was already said, on cosmetic, melanin coloring and gender diversity.
Pam, what you're saying about leadership really strikes me too, because it really is self-defeating when you put a leader in a position that they can't lead in. And one of the things that I've noticed, at least with like leaders of color at the highest, levels, there's this grace and gratitude that is expected. Like, you got the job, don't make waves. You're lucky to be here. We've given you this privilege. You've been granted this opportunity. Don't make waves. Stay the course. Don't change policy. Don't step out and be bold, because you being here is the bold thing already. And that inhibits good leadership. That inhibits leaders in these seats to be able to make the best decision at the right time for the most amount of people. And you really do hate to see it, because what it does is it creates this like loop of how, and I speak as a Black person, and I'm always coming from a Black person's perspective. It creates a leadership around Black leadership. Black leadership is strong, or not strong, is weak, or when it's strong, it's too strong, and it's not diplomatic enough, or it's not taking up the right fights, or it's distracted with the race card and making everything about diversity. And it's like, how can you thrive in that environment? And if you have people in the mid-level seeing how Black leadership is being treated, or seeing how they're not able to really do their jobs in a ideal, or at least the best way that they can, then people don't want those jobs, right? And then the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of there are not enough people of color to be considered for these jobs, it just becomes this cycle. And the reality is that every time we get someone in one of these roles that represents diversity or that brings a fresh perspective, the agencies, these institutions, should support them. They should support them with every resource they have. And they should signal to the rest of the government that, leadership is leadership. And no matter what the color is, we're going to put all of our resources behind making sure these leaders are successful. When what I think happens in reality is that leaders have to be impactful despite all of these other, issues or hindrances, or the fact that there's just an institutional culture that frankly doesn't want to see them succeed. Because if you start to see queer leaders of color doing very, very good, then your whole narrative of the last however many decades is obviously completely dismantled. So it's almost as if the system won't allow Black leaders to be successful, else it will be required to enable more Black leadership or more leadership of color. And that's frustrating, right? And a lot of people who don't want to martyr themselves, don't want to be tokenized, they leave, or they decide to do something that they're maybe even less passionate about. And then that comes back to the same point of like, who's deciding our futures? Not us, because we're not getting an opportunity, and I'm tired of that. And I got a question in the chat, I don't know if everybody saw it, was just about us not being there, national security not being there yet, and kind of getting that excuse over and over again. We're getting there, we're working toward it, we're gonna get there. And how do you reconcile the wait? And the only response I have is like, Black people still waiting on equality. Queer people still waiting on visibility. It's worth the wait. It's not fair, but it's worth the wait. But it's up to us as individuals to determine where will we wait, and what will we give from our daily lives? What time and energy will we take from ourselves and the people we love and our families to be able to try to do something bigger and to try to push forward the the dream that America already put on paper that that we just refuse to realize as a country. And so I can't tell anybody to just, stay at the State Department, stick it out, even if you're being discriminated against, even if you know people are holding bias against you, do it for the future. I can't give that advice. I can say, do what feels authentic to you and don't compromise on a career that you're passionate about. And if you're like me, or if you're like Pam, you just in those places where your passion intersects with these very hard issues, and we'll work through the wait, right? And we'll work through the journey. But that's personal choice that we made. And like, Pam is obviously my hero for being like, I don't do panels unless I want to do a panel. And I never said that out loud, but this is probably the first panel that I've been willing to just say, sure, my opinion matters here, because I don't want to be tokenized, and I know that there are a lot of great Black women at the State Department who are straight, gay, and everything else, and their stories are no less important than mine. And it sometimes feels like we're in a fishbowl of others watching us trauma bond, because they know if you check certain boxes, you've had some trauma. You've been discriminated against. You don't even have to question it. It's like, so what's your story? Like, I'm gonna assume that somebody has been discriminated, and it's almost 100% true. But I don't know how we get to a future where those kind of hierarchies don't exist if we continue to kind of create them amongst ourselves. And so for me, I'm often like, does me being a lesbian have anything to do with this topic or anything? Because if it doesn't, maybe there's someone else who has a more relevant point of view, because this is their passion and this is what they've been doing. And I don't want to put my story ahead of anyone else's because I've been perceived as having a traumatic experience. That feels backwards in a way as well. So dialogue is always great, no matter what. Like, these conversations have to happen. And WCAPS is the beautiful safe space where we can really talk and share amongst ourselves, because otherwise it just often feels like you're being watched and expect, and it's almost like, who has the worst story? Who has the worst coming out story? Whose parents were the meanest, or whose colleagues put them in a corner and didn't talk about that, or didn't let them come to happy hour? Like, those stories are less important than like, how did that queer leader actually get the building to dedicate resources and staff and these things so that they could be a successful leader, so that we don't have to tell trauma stories anymore. We can tell stories of triumph and impact, because we're not here to just make friends. We got big policy goals. We got climate change. We got COVID. We got things that impact masses amount of people. And we still can't get beyond just accepting one person that sits next to us that, whose dates look different than ours do. And so it's bizarre.
Exactly. It's just crazy. And it was so funny that you brought up the trauma bonding, because that is something that I think a lot of us do face, is like, you too? Yeah, you too. And it's sort of this thing. And I make a joke a lot when people ask me about like queer culture. I'm like, well, the first date is usually like, so like, how did you come out? Like, do your parents still love you? And that's something that we laugh about. But at the same time, it's because we're trying to like internalize the shit that we're going through in terms of like all of the other burdens that are being placed on our shoulders that we didn't ask for to be placed on our shoulders. They're just there by how we look, where we come from, how we act, how we describe ourselves. And so Pam, I see you have your hand up still, and then Najin. Okay, so I'll go to Najin Alia.
This is less of an answer, but just like a comment about how something resonated with me that was brought up both in a Q&A question and among some panelists about like, in various contexts, you will be told we're not ready for XYZ yet. And that's actually what started our podcast at this Arab American Community Center, where I proposed an LGBT support group. We were told the community isn't ready. and that essentially saying that is automatically othering the person who is bringing that up by saying like
you're not the community.
You're not the community, even if you're literally in that same space. And I feel like that definitely is a similar experience in the workplace, where if you say like, how can I be more included and be treated equally,
and they say that this place isn't ready,
isn't
it means
quite ready
that means that you're not part of it. It's like, who's not ready? Like the white guy that you're prioritizing his feelings, or everybody else who's potentially coming into this field.
So that's just a statement of solidarity more than an answer of like how we solve this. I don't know yet.
Since we're unmuted, I guess I just want to say we've also had a lot of conversations about trauma bonding in community spaces, as people who, in addition to having this podcast, have been involved in organizing just social and community spaces around similar identities. I think we're like getting to the point, I think in a lot of queer POC communities, just reevaluating our internal dynamics. And, you know, I think just, again, it's the thing we laugh about, but essentially when you trauma bond with someone, I think that keeps us from healing and moving forward and going into a better world, because we're afraid that if we heal from some of that trauma, we won't have that bond anymore. I think like the trauma bond depends on holding on to that trauma. And I think also trauma bonding can be such a fast way of forming bonds and relationships and communities, but also kind of makes people hyper vulnerable in a way that I think is dangerous in some of these spaces. So yeah, I think that's just a thing we're unpacking all around.
Yeah, I think it's funny just because like hashtag trauma bonding is something that I always hear, like you just hear, and it's a sign of having not worked through something yet. Like you're completely on point for that. And it can be applied to a lot of different aspects of life. And I think especially what you're talking about of that feeling of being other, like the community's not ready. We're not ready to have this and this, or, oh, we don't really want to talk about that. And so with that, I'm going to transition into the Q&A section, because if not, I'm pretty sure we could just continuously talk about all these things because you're an amazing group of people. So once again, for the Q&A, I will direct questions to the panelists. I may also answer the questions just if I have some very strong feelings about it. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a Q&A chat. Please type your questions in there. And then once again, if one's for specific panelists, please let them know or state it in the chat. So I'm going to actually sort of circle back to the first question that we received, that someone was saying, like, I have the Wimpy's security reporting portfolio for my office for around 4 years. And I identify as non-binary, and I have difficulty participating in conversations on gender integration that are binary. When I talk about this, we talk about things that are like, we're not there yet. It's like I sit down and shut up. So I guess my question is, how do you deal with the we're not there yet? And so that's sort of been discussed within these like discussions already. But what I think that I also wanted to add in on this is that feeling of othering and being like, hey, if you're saying we're not there yet, that really means like you don't care as much. Like my rights, or the rights and the equal and fair treatment of those that I'm advocating for, or just myself, is not as important as X, Y, and Z, and like what we want to cover, what we feel comfortable with covering. And sometimes, a lot of the times, I think this kind of is also based in a level of ignorance. Like everyone likes to, especially now, you see a lot of DEI experts pop up, where, oh, I'm a DEI expert, where 2 months ago, like, I'm pretty sure you know nothing about DEI. So you see that a lot, and you see people love to say that they're experts about things. I am by no means an expert about almost anything. We're in the Navy, we're called the jack of all trades for a reason. We know a little bit about a lot of different little things. But in that, I think a lot of people, if they don't understand it and they're not willing to learn, or they think it's too daunting of a task to learn, they're just going to push it off and they're not going to want to deal with it. And so then that just creates that same cycle. Is there anything else that any of you would like to add on to this discussion? Or if we sort of like talked it up. Okay, Pam.
I'll say a few things. I mean, one of the things that the panel last week, WCAPS, I also agree, I'm very excited about WCAPS and kind of the space that is being created. But last week, Danielle Anderson is a leader of the Black Veterans Project, and she made a great point. I mean, I fundamentally believe that a lived experience is one of the most important. And she also kind of touched on what you said, which is it is imperative that there are real practitioners and scholars that have invested significant time studying systemic oppression. And so this cannot be treated as some nice to have. Equity in the workplace, in our institutions, in our praxis, in any of our projects is frankly a requirement. We cannot do any of the work that we want to do if our people feel oppressed in the place that they have to spend a majority of their time, of their life, right? And so, you know, one of my own mentors who like strengthened my own wings, her name is Professor Sally Eck. And if you look her up online, she teaches about interrupting oppression in your everyday life. And one of the things all of us should get really sharp on is asking clear questions, right? We don't have to come up with all of the answers, but if somebody is getting paid more in a management or leadership role, frankly, the answer, I don't know when we'll get there, or I don't know what's being done, is no longer sufficient, right? So asking, when will you know? When will the leadership be taking role changes? In 4 months, will we be able to have a clearer answer? You know, and so, you know, that I think takes the onus off of us needing to come up with the questions. I've been in situations where I'll raise, and it's made me not want to do this as much, which is also a problem. But when you raise a dilemma, people will say, "Well, come up with a proposal," which is just you just got assigned to do the work, right? Right? And we should reject that. We advocating for ourselves, particularly in this space, for too long has been treated in a way, even in defensiveness, right? Advocating for ourselves and our dignity and our support has also been treated in many ways, sometimes as a liability to security, peace and security work itself, right? And I personally, like, I'm not super convinced that more people love to say more trainings. We're just going to get more trainings. Trainings without praxis, practice, and institutionalization with consequence, right, is what's going to actually make change. So if this doesn't happen, right, what's going to happen? Like, what are the costs and the losses on teams? And so, you know, the last thing I'll say on this piece, because I think I saw another question, and I'm sorry if I'm jumbling the question and answers on our end, but I also say this as somebody who in the military, in the peace and security world, I, for many years, was that person that was like, I have to say something because I just can't, my heart and my soul can't take injustice in many ways. And the most revolutionary thing that queer and trans, Black and brown folks and leaders can do is that we make sure that we thrive first. It is to make sure that we thrive first. And what that means for me is that, like, sometimes visibility in my case has not been the best. I am constantly consumed by everybody. I'm looked at as the problem solver. And it is important for us to create better litmus tests for ourselves and our own protection. There's nothing wrong with saying, this is not my fight today, right? And sometimes what I do is I document it so I don't forget, right? And I keep it moving. But there is kind of like a self-martyrism that has happened in our sector and with our communities where it's on us to fix all the problems, which is why queer and trans leaders of color are burning out at record rates, while we're also one of the most affected by this pandemic, by injustice and insecurity. It is a cycle that has to stop. And so if anyone hearing this, you know, having your journey coming out and being visible on your own terms is the most revolutionary thing that you can do. And really, taking care of ourselves, right? I had to get a clarity coach and a healing coach for myself, right? A good mentor of mine said, Beyonce doesn't do everything by herself. And so we need to wrap teams around ourselves, because the way that oppression in these spaces works best is when we feel isolated and alone. And so those are my thoughts on that.
Just a quick add on to the idea of asking clear questions. Something I've responded to whenever being told like we're not ready for that, it's not time for that yet, is just, okay, well, when is the time? And seeing what answer they come up with. Because I think there's false ideas about what order justice should happen in. Like with queer rights, oh, first like cis gay men get rights, and then women, and then trans people, which is not historically practically how life goes. Or, you know, first we focus on like cis binary feminism and then trans, you know, and I think if people are putting your own needs as a non-binary person kind of in this false narrative about how gender equality should happen, I think asking like, okay, when we get to this, when there's no patriarchy, because I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon. What if we instead were working on undoing multiple oppressions in tandem? Because when you say this isn't going to happen until XYZ issue is fixed, like that's another way of saying never. Yeah, in my opinion.
Yeah. And then exactly, I have nothing more to add on that, just because like it was so well said by all of you. So another question is, what would you recommend to queer leaders of color who are experiencing a work or organizing environment that isn't supportive, or that they need to stay in for financial reasons until a different opportunity available? On the flip side, you're able to make or might.
Hi, Rachel. I think your video got a little problematic there. Could you just repeat the question?
Oh.
Thanks.
Sure. So the question is, what would you recommend environment that isn't supported, or that they need to stay in for financial reasons until a different opportunity becomes available? On the flip side, when do you know you're able to or might be able to make progress in a space that is dominated by hegemonic narratives? Does anyone want to take that? I hope my video is not like messing up again. So I'll answer first on this one, I think, and answering very honestly in terms of, if you're experiencing a lack of, if you're experiencing a work or organizing environment that isn't supportive, I think you have to understand like where your red lines are, like where, like I understand like there's the financial needs of what you need to do, and like the red lines, because what we talk about when we talk about taking care of yourself and taking care of the mental health portions of yourself, it's not going to do you any good if you're going to burn yourself out, or if you are just going to beat yourself down so much that you can't even, like, you lose your sense of self by staying in an environment like this. At the same time, there's also usually opportunities to, and I say this as sort of like a knee jerk, oh, to report it, to document it, things like that. But I'm sure most of us from experience know that that's not always going to work. Like the amount of times that, especially in the military, that people report sexual assault or harassment or racism or homophobia, many times those don't go anywhere. And you may have seen the video that was going around on Twitter where the Marine had a sexual assault case, and the command decided to keep the perpetrator in the chain in the command. So like things like that. I think it's a hard question to answer. Like when is your red line to get out of a situation and try and find something different? And then on the flip side, when you know you might be able to make progress in a hegemonic narrative, is sometimes I take the opportunity where people talk about DEI or people talk about like, oh, we're going to do this, this, and this. Like, all right, and you call them out on it. Like, if you really want to make change, then you have to do this. We can't keep this cycle. And it's about holding the power. Like Pam was saying earlier, like people just like to hold this power. And so this is that time where there's this huge push for all of this. Say, okay, like if you really, really actually want to do this correctly, then you're going to have to listen. You're going to have to figure out like what the next steps are and how to actually meaningfully create change. And so for me, it's just like if people are willing to listen, and it kind of is a gut check for me. Like if I know I'm in a community where there is going to be at least one receptive voice, I will try. If I am met with resistance and pushback or steamrolling, when I talk to people, then I'm just like, you know what? I'm going to put my emotional labor and like my passions in another place where I know that I can make a difference.
I agree 100% with Rachel's perspective on that. And I'd also add, like, if you have one of these jobs where like 4:30 on Sunday, your stomach starts hurting at the idea of like Monday morning going into work, having to deal with people who underappreciate you or probably holding crazy biases against you. The biggest piece of advice I have is if you can find your tribe at work, even if that's one person, if that's a lunch group. And I mean, the world is different now, but in the darkest moments of my career and the hardest times, having my tribe, these are, people who understand the job, because sometimes you can't go talk to your family and your friends because they don't have enough context to really give you the type of support you need. But having a tribe at work is critical. And if you're in a situation where you really do feel alone and isolated, putting your time and energy into yourself and finding something that will finding a place to work where you can thrive and where you can make the money and do the things you want to do should be a priority. I know people sometimes feel guilt about looking for jobs and how do they manage that. If you need to get out of a situation for your mental health and for your ultimate well-being, that has to then become your priority. But in the meantime, while you still got to get checks and you still have to eat every day, if you can find some people in your organization that you can trust, that you can go to happy hour with, or that you can chat when, it's a difference between, you yelling at somebody or you doing something that you might regret or that doesn't represent who you want to be. Because I mean, we know we get put in really bad situations, and if you feeling isolated, you don't have anyone to talk to. It's only worse. And discrimination and bias makes you feel crazy. It makes you feel like you're doing something wrong. It makes you feel like you are wrong. And if you don't have someone in your support system that can just look you in your eye and say, you're not wrong, log out for me today, boo, go home, whatever you might need, you're not doing yourself any favor. And for folks who really can't find a tribe at work, my heart goes out to you, because there are people on this call right now. Marcus Coleman is on this call. He's a huge supporter of women and peace and security. And he's been my tribe for the last 3 years. And big and small, it's so important to have someone that you can talk to at work, especially if you're making a transition. Because, we can't do this stuff alone. And if you're at that point in your career, you're already struggling emotionally and mentally. And so creating ways to take care of yourself, even at work, is allowed. And I would encourage it.
Nadia and Alia, did you have something?
Yeah, sorry, we're just struggling with the unmute button. You want to go first, or?
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna avoid going on a tangent about my day job because we're here to talk about the podcast. But I'll just say that I've dealt with a lot of shit at work when trying to push back on certain things. And there's been a lot of gaslighting. I will say, like, having this podcast as like something we are doing outside of work has been so refreshing, because it is a space that we create for ourselves. And I don't know if you want to add to
I mean, I don't know, it's right, it's just hard. I think we're all in this situation at some point or another, like deciding how much you're going to speak up, how much you're going to like put your head down and get the paycheck. And obviously this is something you just need to like navigate with your own financial circumstances, but I think sometimes like the most change, like the most emboldening moments are in that in-between stage where you decide that I am able to walk away from this. If I lose my job, I'm fine. I'm okay with that outcome. And now I'm going to see how much I can push and how many risks I can take without totally prioritizing protecting my status in this institution and also not totally walking away from it. But again, that's something that you need to have a certain level of life security, financial security to make that decision for yourself. But yeah, I like you said, I think it's sometimes if the way you make change and the way you make money can't coexist, they can be separate. You can look outside of your work to see where you can engage your values and passions.
At least temporarily,
right.
while you're figuring out the next move financially.
Yeah, that's very true. All right, so there's one in the chat. I'm not sure if I made it over to the Q&A, but national security narratives tends to focus on military dominance, American supremacy, and exceptionalism. How can we achieve a more inclusive system when this is the narrative? What other narratives can we use? Pam, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this has become the core bulk of my work. It's frankly the main reason why I even chose this path. You know, as you mentioned, I started organizing in the military. I am proudly enlisted. A lot of people think that I went to some academy, but you know, I was proudly enlisted, but I was in a unique job where I was working with high-ranking officers. I was, you know, a young queer Latina at the front of the room briefing high-level commanders on, you know, what at the time was cataloged as counterterrorism. And very quickly, you know, I started to understand how our security policies was inherently racist. And, you know, I organized in my unit. When I say I organized in the military, is that I started seeing, I went from a unit, I testified to Congress about this, but I went from a unit that was, you know, healthy, incredible. I was really, you know, supported, to all of a sudden leadership change, and it was deeply racist, misogynistic, retaliation against predominantly younger enlisted women of color. And so I organized military officers and enlisted and filed an IG complaint. And the reason I tell this story is that it made me really think a lot about my biggest fear, which is the consolidation of hegemony in the national security world. When I was in the military, and I would have colleagues say racist things, it's frankly, the military is the worst place to organize. And it was the place that I decided to say, I think that's not right. Tell me what you mean when you say illegals, right? And it really showed me, and it challenged me to think about the way that the reality is that this power structure is enormous. It is one of the most traditional. In fact, I think that the military and national security sector is 50 years behind almost any other sector in many ways. And so one of the things that I've thought about a lot is, how do we meet people where they are? And let me be clear, like, I don't believe in unity with white nationalists, right? That's kind of important for us to say at this point. But it is important for us to take ownership and redefine. And one of the most important things we need to get more comfortable with is dissent and critique of these institutions, right? American exceptionalism has failed us, is untrue. And supremacy and dominance is a failed doctrine and strategy, right? And so the other flip side of this that I'll say is that this is why I'm so invested in grassroots organizing, is that we need to build better relationships and understand and disrupt our own assumptions as to why people, you know, I think it was said earlier, when communities who have been over policed and over surveyed and targeted hear security and national security narratives, it does inspire an allergy and a legitimate fear, right? Because of that existence. And so I'm proud that WCAPS is creating new spaces where we can redefine this, where we can meet different communities. You know, I know that Rachel and I have been part of conversations that bridge military practitioners and folks with folks who are doing civil society work, right? We have to really get better at principled struggle. We have to get better at understanding how to meet people where they're at, disrupt assumptions about what do you actually mean. Because if I'm going to keep it 100, there's a lot of folks that have coined themselves foreign policy national security strategists, or experts who, frankly, they themselves don't understand the differences between the terms and the actual impacts of civil conflict. So we have a real opportunity. The future of this sector will be defined by people like us. And it is most important that we center the most marginalized, the occupied, the harmed, in order to better understand what the future of the sector is going to be, and for us to build more cohesive narratives. The last thing I'll say is, who are we talking to really matters. I used to feel a lot of shame about code switching, and now I realize it's a superpower. Who are we talking to that we want to change their minds, that we want to build these coalitions? You know, my goal is that we get someone's grandmother in West Virginia to understand, right, what we're talking about, to get asylum seeking, you know, communities under attack to also feel bought in to this space, and to folks that have our experiences to seek leadership. So that's what it's going to take, I think.
One thing I'll add on the messaging piece, I in and of itself, I don't think the narrative around America being exceptional is problematic. What we don't do, though, is go below the surface to explain what we mean by that exceptionalism. Because if you ask me why I think America is exceptional, I'll say because Black and Brown people have fought their way through to, you know, have built this country, then fought tooth and nail to push for civil rights movements and movements that have made life better for Americans. And that in America, despite all the challenges, some of us can still break through and realize our dreams and live our full potential. So I think when we say America is exceptional, because the narrative has been so strong since the beginning of the country's founding, a lot of people assume that exceptionalism is because it's white and it's powerful and we have military power and we're exceptional because we can go around the world and get what we want from countries. That's not why we're exceptional at all, right? We're exceptional for a different reason, and we've got to build a narrative that says we're exceptional because even when our democracy is threatened, we can power through. We're exceptional because we can see the value in all human beings who want to contribute to global change. There is a whole lot of humility, especially moving forward, that's going to have to go into how America talks about itself to the world. And I think post January 6th, if we don't see our global leader, our country's leaders approach messaging from a place of, we do not always get it right. We are often exceptional for the wrong reasons, but we are exceptional for great reasons as well. And, you know, to you know, something that was mentioned earlier, we can't be judgmental and looking down on the state of other communities and then coming into these communities with the solution they should implement, right? Because we want to be saviors or we want to promote democracy around the world. Yes, that's important, but what will really be exceptional is that if we actually lived our values and we actually were an example for the world where people wouldn't need us because they'd be able to see what we were doing. And if they wanted our support or they wanted to engage Americans on lessons learned about any topic area you choose, then that would be on them, because we are living our authentic selves as a country and other people see the value in it because we are the best, because we have the best tech, because we're meeting climate change with great solutions, because our stats are changing. To me, it wouldn't be an issue if folks didn't read American exceptionalism in the old way, right? It's great to be exceptional, but why? And when you aren't exceptional and when you fail, like when you fail at protecting huge portions of your population, or when you fail at creating economic equality for people, or when you fail at even giving a living wage to folks in this country, or when you have starving people in the greatest country ever, when you fail at being exceptional, you have to be just as loud about owning that failure and speaking out about the ways in which you're addressing it. We can't sweep our problems under the rug, over exaggerate our wins, and then expect other countries around the world to say, oh yeah, we want to be like the United States, because what is the United States at that point, right? So it's going to take some truth telling. It's going to take some internal messaging and us being honest with ourselves as a country about where we are. and then reshaping the narrative to say, ultimately, we don't always get it right, but our intent and our dead setness on getting it right in the long term is what drives us, then even when we fail, I think that's a more palpable thing to understand. Like if you know someone is hardworking at an individual level and you know they try and when they get it wrong, they apologize, and when they get it right, they accept the celebration. When they make mistakes, you can understand it more and you can actually have a dialogue. But if you're dealing with a person or a country that can never make a mistake, that is always right, that is better than every other country, the best to ever do it, nobody's ever done it better, nobody can ever be better than us, that type of thing makes you so unrelatable. And it's not that hard, right? Like I often apply individual dynamics at a country level. And if I don't believe you, if I don't think you're authentic, your message to me is not going to resonate. I don't even think you believe what you're saying. And so it's a good question, and it's something that I hope we really do see moving forward with our leadership.
Exactly. I love everything that has been said on this panel, because there's just so much truth and honesty and directness to it. And believe me, we will have more of these conversations in the future. And I just wanted to highlight something that Ambassador Jenkins said in the chat, right? Are we ready to be honest with ourselves as Americans? Like, what does exceptionalism mean, as Amber and Pam, you've been talking about? And we need to redefine national security, because national security no longer means that hard combat, arms, the power, the force, the military force that we have. It also means diplomacy. It means climate security, health security, food security, everything that we've been talking about here. And just hearing some of the big takeaways on this panel, right? Humility. We need to have humility in what we've been doing. And the grassroots organizing is where a lot of the real change is going to come from. And just elevating the voices of those who have their own agency and showing that they're perfectly capable of representing themselves, but they need to just have that space and the opportunity to do it on, say, a podcast. And just to hear all of these different opportunities and recommendations. And the last thing that I'm going to ask everyone to do on the panel is if you have thoughts, like last sort of final thoughts within 60 seconds or so, because I know that we're coming up on time. I will actually start really quickly, because one thing that I want everyone to leave here with is that your emotional labor should not be free. Like if someone comes up to you and asks you, oh, like you should be part of this group, you should be part of this group. If that's your passion, great, wonderful. If that's not, and you don't have the time, say, no, I know experts in this space who are much better at this than I am. Or if you pay me, I will do this, because we should be charging the amount of times that someone reaches out to me and asking for advice or for things. I'm happy to give, but at some point it's going to burn me out. And so you have to understand that point and understand your mental capacity. And the last thing is, if you are someone, and this is more not to the WCAPS group, but this is more to those who have joined us as allies and as honestly as white people and white straight people coming into this space. If you are working on intersectionality, or if you are working on diversity and inclusion, and you look around the room and there is only white men, there's only white women, or there's only like one person of color, you're probably doing it wrong. And with that, I will turn to the panelists, and we'll start with Pam.
Cool. So the quick thing I will say is the changes I want to make are going to far supersede my lifetime. I'm very clear on that. And so my job is to move this mountain as much as I can, and I can't do it alone. So our liberation is intimately connected to each other. That's one of the biggest things I want people to take away, right? I think someone asked a question about being straight presenting. I'm straight presenting. I can never know what the experience is of a Black, queer, or trans person, of a transgender person. But I'll tell you, the transgender ban is one of the most impactful, humbling experiences of my life. And we need to hold two things, which is I can never speak for those communities, and it is my duty to make sure I'm informed enough so that I can speak up when those folks are not in the room, right? And I think that's it. I think that's it. Just thanks for having me.
Amber?
The only thing I'll say is that this has been a remarkably just feel good, motivating moment. I mean, taking time out to have these conversations really does matter because we're all we have, and for folks who might be struggling at work, I want folks to feel free to reach out to me because I've been in that situation, and it's not easy. And unfortunately, I can never advise someone to leave a job before they have another one because I can't pay their rent. And so I just want folks to know that if you are struggling, particularly with your identity at work, that it can get better, but you absolutely have options. And you absolutely have people who will give you support and encouragement and the tools to make a fuss about it and to go through the organizational channels, because that matter. We have to leverage the processes that are in place to be able to address these things from a systematic perspective. But as Pam said earlier, your mental health, your safety, the safety of your body and your person it can't be overstated. And the government needs us. The government needs us. Our perspective is the only. A diversity of perspectives is the only way we're going to get to a future that we can even begin to envision. And we probably won't see it, but one thing I'm committed to is going to work, giving 100% every day, because this is my passion, but I'm not giving more than I can give. And I'm not gonna allow the discomfort of others to make me internalize things that just aren't true. And for the folks who, I appreciate the people who don't want to wait and feel that frustration around, well, it'll get better. It needs to be better now. And it'll never be something I can accept, even if I can live in it. So thank y'all for being here. And again, Rachel, you've been an amazing facilitator, moderator, and designer of this program. So thank you for your labor.
Of course, this is what I love to do. And then Nadia and Alia.
I just want to second what Pam said, first of all, about like all of our liberation is bonded together. And I think just making those ties is important, whether it's between people of like different identities or different positionalities with regards to the government or the system. I think we just need to move away from narratives that pit multiple oppressed groups against each other and instead move towards like, how can we make life better for all of us?
Right. Like, how can we support each other and also recognize that we can't speak for each other?
Totally. Yeah. And then on the, I guess, kind of continuing the convo about coming out at work and such, we talk about this a lot on our podcast. We didn't exactly get into it today, but just there's no right way to do things. No one has to be out. No one has to present a certain way. There's no correct way to be queer. There's no correct way to present your queerness to the world. We're in jobs and systems that have rules, but queerness itself doesn't have rules. So you do you, and then have compassion for people who are doing it differently. Yeah.
Thank you all once again for taking the time out of your busy schedules to provide and have this space and share this space with me and the rest of the audience. And I also did want to give another shout out to Ambassador Jenkins. Thank you so much for everything and for creating this space and creating this amazing community where we can talk freely and we can talk about the realest shit and be like, no, like let's sit down and actually have a discussion on what needs to change instead of these flowery policy recommendations that don't actually go anywhere. So with that, thank you everyone for coming to this panel. Thank you so much for being here with us. We will absolutely be doing more of these in the future because as the panelists have discussed, there are a lot of things that we can cover. And so I welcome you to share, to visit WCAPS.org and to just get involved and continue to ask questions. Thank you so much to everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.